Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. So you sent over this incredibly detailed report on what went down in the crypto market this past week from Monday, March 31st to Sunday, April 6th, 2025. And we could easily spend hours just skimming the surface, but
Oh, absolutely.
that's not what we do here, right? We like to go, we like to deep dive.
That's right, a deep dive. We've got a weekly crypto market report here. It's got all the price data for all the major coins, some really insightful analysis on what moved the market, and they even rank the top 10 news stories
Oh, wow.
in terms of impact. So we're going to take all of that and try to distill it down to what really matters. I'm going to help you guys understand not just what happened, but the why behind it all.
Okay, so looking at this report, it looks like it was a pretty volatile week for crypto. Lots of things going on, macroeconomic factors, some regulatory developments, and then, just things happening within the crypto space itself.
Yeah, it's like all these different forces colliding. You can't really separate them out,
Mm.
Right. News, the global economy, everything's kind of intertwined.
Exactly. So we're going to break it all down for you, starting with Bitcoin, then Ethereum and Solana. We'll see how those big players fared, and then we'll look at some of the other notable movers, the altcoins that made some waves this week.
Right, and then we'll really dig into those top news stories and see how they influence things.
Perfect. So Bitcoin, starting point around $83,650, then boom, up to $88,000 by April 2nd.
Why to jump?
Huge jump, right? But then things reversed, down to $82,000 by April 4th, and then a little bit of a recovery to close the week at about $84,000.
Yeah, so a small gain overall, something like 0.4%, but definitely a roller coaster to get there.
Definitely a roller coaster. So what was driving that initial surge, that big push up to $88,000?
Well, if you look at the timing, it seems pretty clear that it was tied to the anticipation around President Trump's Liberation Day tariff announcements. There was a lot of buzz leading up to it, and it looks like the market was, it was hoping for some pro-crypto policies to be part of the package.
Okay, so the market's getting ahead of itself, pricing in this potential good news, and then, bam, the tariffs are announced, and that's what triggers the pullback, right?
Exactly. On April 2nd, when those tariffs on over 100 nations were unveiled, it really spooked investors.
Wow.
Classic risk-off sentiment. Global trade tensions tend to make people a little more cautious, and even though crypto is becoming more established, it still gets lumped in with those riskier assets.
Yeah, that makes sense. But then we see a bit of a rebound later in the week. What was behind that? How did Bitcoin climb back to $84,000?
There were a couple of things that helped. First, the news came out about those U.S. federal agencies having to disclose their crypto holdings. That was seen as a positive sign.
Yeah, more transparency.
Right, more transparency. And it kind of signaled that the government's taking digital assets more seriously, which is always good for sentiment. And then on top of that, we saw a broader recovery attempt across the altcoin market, which probably gave Bitcoin a little bit of a boost as well.
Okay, so Bitcoin ends the week with a small gain, but it certainly wasn't a smooth ride. Now, let's talk about Ethereum. It seems like ETH had a rougher go of it.
Yeah, definitely not as resilient. It started the week at $9,886. but then plummeted down to $788 by April 4th. That's a 5.3% drop in a single day.
Yeah.
Ouch. It did recover a little bit to close at $8,820, but that still puts it down about 3.5% for the week.
So what was going on there? Why was ETH struggling even before the tariff news hit?
Well, for one thing, its burn rate was hitting record lows after that Denkin upgrade.
Okay, and just to remind folks, the burn rate is basically how much ETH is being permanently removed from circulation, right?
Exactly. So a low burn rate usually suggests less activity on the network, which isn't a great sign. And then to make matters worse, there was a massive liquidation event on April 2nd, like $66 million worth of positions getting wiped out.
Wow, that's a lot of leverage getting unwound. And then the tariff news just poured more fuel on the fire, right?
Yeah.
Pushing ETH below $1,800.
Yeah, it was a 1-2 punch. That broader market shift away from risk assets definitely hurt. But the report mentions this critical support zone between $1,886 and $1,944, where over 3 million ETH investors were holding. That seemed to provide some much-needed stability.
So some resilience there, but still a negative week for Ethereum. What about that little bounce back we saw?
It seems like it was mostly driven by the general altcoin recovery attempt. But it's interesting to note that ETH lagged behind Bitcoin.
Okay.
The report suggests that this could be due to increased competition from other Layer 1 blockchains like Solana and even from XRP.
So even within the crypto space, it's a dog-eat-dog world.
Oh, absolutely. Always evolving.
All right, let's move on to Solana. This one seems like it was a wild ride.
Oh, yeah. Definitely volatile week for SOL. It
Yeah.
started at $129, then crashed down to $112.50 by April 3rd. That's let me check, yeah, 12.75% drop.
Yikes. What happened there?
Well, it looks like there was a lot of selling pressure from the big players, the whales. They dumped something like $200 billion worth of SOL tokens right before a major unlock event scheduled for April 4th.
Okay, so they're getting out ahead of a potential influx of new tokens hitting the market, right?
Exactly. And that created a lot of fear of oversupply, fear of the price dropping even further. And then, of course, the tariff news didn't help.
So internal concerns about the unlock and then external pressure from the broader market. It was a double whammy. But we did see Solana stabilize a bit towards the end of the week, right? Back up to $115.
Yeah, it seems like it found some support. There's still a lot of institutional interest in Solana, and the potential for ETFs is still a big driver. And like we saw with the other coins, there was that general attempt at a bullish recovery in the altcoin market late in the week, which probably helped.
Okay, so a rough week for Solana, but still some positive factors in play. Now let's move beyond the big three and look at some of those other notable movers. It sounds like it was a pretty tough week for most altcoins.
Oh yeah, it was a sea of red out there. Very few exceptions to the downward trend.
The report mentions Tongcoin plummeting 14% by April 5th. What happened there?
Well, the general altcoin sell-off driven by the tariffs definitely played a role, but it's also possible that Tongcoin had just run out of steam. You know,
Hmm.
it had been on a pretty good run, so maybe some people were just taking profits.
Right, classic buy the rumor, sell the news kind of situation. What about Chainlink? It dropped 11% by April 5th, even though there were some large transactions earlier in the week.
Yeah, that's interesting. It shows that even when you have big players buying, it's not always enough to overcome that negative market sentiment.
Right, the macro picture can really dominate.
Exactly. And SUI also took a hit, down 12.5% by April 5th.
Yeah, it looks like it was just caught in the crossfire. Nothing specific to Sue itself, just the broader altcoin struggles.
Right, no real positive catalyst to counter the negative pressure.
Okay, and then we have Polygon. Briefly gained some traction midweek thanks to some whale activity, but then ended up flat, maybe even slightly down.
Yeah, another example of how those positive coin-specific developments can get overshadowed by the overall market mood.
Right. And then we have Solana, still considered a top mover even with that 11% loss.
Yeah, gotta remember, it's a big player. And that ETF narrative is still keeping it in the spotlight.
Okay, so lots to unpack there. But now let's dive into those top 10 crypto-related news stories of the week, starting with the biggest one, Trump's tariffs triggering that crypto sell-off. We've talked about it, but let's break it down further.
Sure, so the announcement on April 2nd, tariffs on over 100 nations, that was the catalyst. By April 4th, the market was really feeling it. Bitcoin down to $82,000, Ethereum to $1,788, Solana down to $112.50. The CD20 index, which tracks the overall crypto market, was down 3%, and over $300 million in positions got liquidated.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a bloodbath, especially for altcoins. This really shows how sensitive the crypto market is to global economic events.
Absolutely. News story number 2 is that big Solana drop, the 12.75% crash. Again, we discussed it, but the report really highlights those fears of increased supply.
Yeah, those whales dumping $200 million worth of SOL before the unlock event, that was huge. It was the largest single-day unlock Solana had seen since 2023. So the market was really worried about a flood of new tokens hitting the market and driving the price down even further. And the fact that those whales were moving their SOL into stablecoins, well, that just added to the fear.
Okay, so tokenomics matter.
Oh, they absolutely do.
News story number 3 is a more positive one. The U.S. agencies being required to disclose their crypto holdings. It seems like this helped with the late week recovery.
Yeah, definitely a positive sign. It shows that the government is taking digital assets seriously and that they're becoming more integrated into traditional financial systems. And that's good for long-term sentiment.
Okay, number 4, that Bitcoin surged to $88,000 before the tariff crash. Talk about a roller coaster.
Yeah, it was a classic case of buy the rumor, sell the news, all that hype about potential pro-crypto policies, and then boom, reality sets in. It shows how volatile the market can be and how sensitive it is to news and expectations.
Definitely. Okay, news story number 5, Ethereum dropping below $1,800. Again, we talked about the price action, but what about those liquidations in that key support area?
Right, over $66 million in liquidations. That's a lot of leveraged positions getting wiped out. But the fact that the support zone between $1,886 and $1,944 held, that was important. It shows that those key levels can act as a buffer, preventing even bigger losses.
Number 6, the altcoin bloodbath. It really seems like those tariff concerns hit the altcoin market especially hard.
Oh, yeah. Altcoins are generally seen as riskier than Bitcoin, so when there's fear in the market, they tend to get hit harder.
Makes sense. Okay, news story number 7. Trump expanding his crypto empire. A dollar-backed stablecoin, digital asset investment funds. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting, right? It shows that even though he might have triggered a sell-off with those tariffs, he's still very much involved in the crypto space. And this could actually be good for the market in the long run, more mainstream adoption, more political support.
Yeah, it's a complex relationship. Okay, number 8. Gold-backed tokens going up in value while the rest of the market is crashing. That's fascinating.
It is. It shows that even within the crypto market, there are different ways to manage risk. Some investors clearly saw those gold-backed tokens as a safe haven, a way to hedge against the volatility.
Okay, news story number 9. Conor McGregor launching a meme coin. Not exactly market-moving news, but still interesting.
Yeah, more of a cultural moment, right?
hmm
It shows how mainstream crypto is becoming, but it didn't really have a big impact on prices. Meme coins are pretty volatile anyway, and the overall market sentiment was just too bearish.
Right. And finally, number 10. Fed Governor Waller saying nice things about stablecoins. Again, more of a long-term positive than an immediate market mover.
Exactly. Regulatory support is always good, but it wasn't enough to overcome the negative impact of the tariffs in the short term. Still, it's a good sign for the future of stablecoins and their role in the financial system.
Okay, so a lot happened this week. It was a wild ride, but it really highlights how intertwined the crypto market is with global events and traditional finance.
Yeah, it's not an isolated bubble anymore. It's connected to everything else.
So what does this mean for the future of crypto? As it becomes more integrated into the mainstream, will it be even more susceptible to these global shocks? And how should investors be thinking about managing risk in this new environment? Those are some things to think about as we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.